Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're taking a deep and detailed look at what a U.S. attack on Iran would mean for the United States, for Iran, and for the broader region. This is a complex topic with layers of political, military, and economic consequences. So in this script, we will explore every angle with clear and short paragraphs while keeping the flow smooth and easy to understand. A situation like this would reshape global dynamics, disrupt alliances, and trigger responses far beyond the battlefield. And understanding these possibilities is essential for anyone following world affairs when discussing a potential U.S. attack on Iran. The first thing to understand is that nothing in the Middle East happens in isolation. Every action connects to decades of history, tensions, and strategic rivalries. The U.S. and Iran have been locked in a long-standing conflict shaped by ideology, regional power struggles, nuclear concerns, and military competition. An attack would not simply be a military strike. It would be the ignition of consequences that touch nearly every corner of the world. The reasons behind such an attack would likely be tied to nuclear escalation, attacks by regional proxies, or a direct confrontation involving U.S. assets in the region. These triggers would matter because they define how other nations react and how far the conflict could expand. For the United States, launching an attack on Iran would be a major decision with enormous strategic risks. Even a limited strike would place the U.S. at the center of a conflict involving political backlash, potential retaliation, threats to global oil markets, and diplomatic consequences. The U.S. military is strong and capable of delivering massive damage quickly. But war is not only about capability, it is also about endurance, political will, and global legitimacy. An attack would test all three. Domestically, public opinion would be shaped by the scale of the conflict and the reasons behind it. Economically, energy prices could rise sharply, affecting American consumers and global markets. Militarily, the U.S. would be forced to allocate significant assets to protect bases, ships, and personnel across the Middle East. For Iran, the consequences would be equally intense but very different in nature. Iran's leadership has built its strategy around asymmetric warfare, regional influence, and missile capabilities designed to deter or respond to attacks. A U.S. strike could damage Iranian infrastructure, military sites, nuclear facilities, and command structures. But it would not eliminate Iran's ability to respond. Iran has a network of allied groups across the region, often referred to as proxies, that could attack U.S. forces, bases, and partners. Iran's geography also gives it control over critical waterways like the Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant portion of global oil passes. Even limited disruption there could send shockwaves through the global economy. Iran's political leadership would also use the attack to rally national unity, presenting itself as the victim of foreign aggression. Looking at the broader region, the effects would be massive. Countries close to Iran such as Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE host major U.S. bases, making them potential targets of Iranian retaliation. Israel would almost certainly prepare for missile threats from Iranian-linked groups in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Gaza. Saudi Arabia, a key U.S. partner and regional rival to Iran, would face the risk of drone and missile strikes on its oil facilities. The entire Gulf region would shift into emergency mode, with governments reinforcing security, protecting infrastructure, and preparing for the spread of conflict. The political temperature across the Middle East would rise dramatically, and many regional economies would suffer immediate stress. On the global stage, the reaction would depend on the duration and intensity of the conflict. If the attack is limited and controlled, World powers like China, Russia, and the European Union would call for de-escalation while assessing how the situation affects their economic interests and alliances. If the conflict grows into a prolonged war, these powers might take more direct positions. Russia, already aligning with Iran in several regions, might increase military or intelligence support to Tehran. China, heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil, would push aggressively for diplomatic solutions while preparing for energy disruptions. European nations would worry about refugee flows, terrorism risks, and economic instability. Energy markets would react instantly. Oil prices would spike because Iran is a major producer, and because any threat to the Strait of Hormuz impacts global supply. This rise would affect not only oil but also transportation, manufacturing, and consumer goods, placing pressure on economies worldwide. Nations that rely heavily on imported oil would face inflation and distribution challenges. Meanwhile, energy-producing nations outside the Middle East might temporarily benefit from higher prices but would still worry about long-term instability. The global economic system is interconnected, and a major conflict involving Iran would highlight just how dependent modern economies are on peaceful transport routes and stable markets. Diplomatically, a U.S. attack would strain relationships with various partners. Allies in Europe may criticize the action if they believe it escalates tensions unnecessarily. Countries that try to maintain neutral or balanced relationships between the U.S. and Iran, such as Turkey and India, would face difficult choices. International institutions like the United Nations would be forced to address emergency resolutions, humanitarian risks, and calls for ceasefires. The political landscape would shift noticeably, with new alliances forming and existing ones being tested. From a military perspective, the U.S. has overwhelming power, but Iran's strategy is built around resilience rather than direct confrontation. Iran cannot defeat the U.S. in a conventional war, but it can make the conflict costly and prolonged. Its missile arsenal is large and capable of striking regional bases and cities. Its cyber capabilities could target U.S. infrastructure, financial systems, or private companies. Its regional allies could open multiple fronts across several countries simultaneously. This network defense makes Iran harder to neutralize and increases the risk of the conflict expanding beyond initial expectations. Inside Iran, a U.S. attack would have significant political effects. Hardline factions would gain power and influence, using the conflict to demonstrate resistance to foreign intervention. Public sentiment might rally behind the government, even among groups that have historically protested against it. At the same time, economic hardships from war could strain the population and lead to long-term instability. The leadership would try to balance domestic control, military strategy, and international messaging as it responds to the attack. For the U.S., one of the major concerns would be maintaining control over the scale and duration of the conflict. A short, precise operation could be possible, but once retaliation begins, preventing escalation becomes difficult. U.S. forces in Iraq, Syria, and across the Gulf would face constant threats. Protecting shipping lanes, allies, and military assets would require substantial resources. The Pentagon would have to prepare for expanded operations, possible ground deployments, and humanitarian support missions if the region faces widespread disruption. The political impact in the United States would also be substantial. Leaders would face pressure from various sides, some demanding stronger action, others calling for restraint. Elections could be influenced by how the conflict develops. Economic concerns at home might increase as fuel prices rise and foreign policy becomes a central issue in political debates. Americans would closely watch whether the conflict achieves strategic goals or drags the country into another prolonged Middle Eastern war. One of the biggest uncertainties would be how long the conflict lasts and what the end game looks like. A single strike might be limited in objective, but retaliation could lead to a cycle of attacks that becomes difficult to stop. A prolonged conflict could reshape the Middle East for years. Nations might realign politically and militarily in response to the shifting balance of power. New security coalitions might emerge, while older alliances could weaken because of disagreements over strategy and responsibility. Over time, humanitarian concerns would grow. Any major conflict risks civilian casualties, displacement, and damage to critical infrastructure. Aid groups and international organizations would face challenges in delivering support due to security risks. The global community would debate how to manage these crises while pushing for negotiations and peace agreements. The human cost of such a conflict would be a central issue affecting international opinion and diplomatic pressure. Cyber warfare would likely become a major component of the conflict. Iran and the U.S. both have advanced cyber capabilities, and attacks on financial systems, government networks, and industrial operations could escalate quickly. The digital battlefield would expand the conflict beyond the Middle East, potentially affecting systems in Europe, Asia, and North America. Cyber incidents could create confusion, panic, or economic damage that spreads far beyond the military confrontation. In the aftermath of an attack, both nations would face difficult choices. The U.S. would need to determine how to prevent further escalation while protecting its personnel and interests. Iran would need to decide how far to push its retaliation without risking total destruction. Diplomacy might eventually return to the center of the conversation, but only after significant damage has already been done. The rebuilding of trust, regional stability, and diplomatic channels would take years, and the world would feel the consequences long after the fighting stops. Even after the conflict ends, the global landscape would not return to normal quickly. Energy markets would remain sensitive. Regional powers would continue adjusting their strategies. The political narratives inside Iran and the United States would shift permanently. The Middle East would see new realities in terms of military presence, alliances, and security concerns. Every nation connected to the region, either through geography or trade, would feel the ripple effects. Ultimately, a U.S. attack on Iran would set into motion one of the most significant geopolitical events of the modern era. Both nations would suffer consequences in different ways, and the world would face economic, political, and security challenges that could last for years. Understanding these layers helps us see why leaders on all sides approach these decisions with caution, and why the world watches developments in the region so closely. If such a conflict ever unfolds, it will not simply be another chapter in regional tensions. It would be a turning point with effects reaching far beyond military calculations. It would reshape alliances, economies, public opinions, and diplomatic strategies worldwide. Every move would matter. Every reaction would add to a chain of events, with the potential to redefine global order for an entire generation. Thank you for watching. If you found this explanation helpful, make sure to stay tuned for more detailed and informative breakdowns on global events.